You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is the Unsolved Crewe murders. Now, a family disappeared, all except for one, and the remaining would make this case even more baffling than it already was. By the way, I am posting so much content for Suspect Summer this July, so make sure you are subscribed down below. Now let's get back to the story. I want to say that these are all names that are a little bit hard for me to pronounce, so I'm super sorry if I butcher them, but please correct me nicely down below. So it was 1970 in New Zealand, and the Crewe family lived on their farm in Pukekawa, Lower Waikato. The Crewe family consisted of Jeanette Lenore, who was a teacher, and her husband David Henry, who was a farmer at the time, and they bought his grandparents' farm together. They had sheep and cows and a successful life and business, and in 1968 their family would grow once again because Jeanette would have a little baby girl named Rochelle Janine. However, this fantasy life of theirs would soon change. It was 2 years later, on June 22nd of 1970, and Jeanette, who was 30 at the time, and David, who was 28 at the time, would go missing. Nobody saw them for about 5 days, and eventually Jeanette's father, Lynn, would be called because a customer of theirs who wanted to buy some livestock could not get a hold of them whatsoever, and so he decided to call Lynn and ask him if he would check on them to see what was up, if he could come and get the livestock anytime soon. And so Lynn Dimler, who was Jeanette's father, went over to their farm that day and noticed right away that the porch and the kitchen lights were on, and also the back door lock still had the key in it. However, we think of this as super strange today, but back then it was really pretty common. I mean, doors were left open anyway, so it didn't really matter if a key was actually in the lock or not. However, once he got inside, he noticed that the furniture was moved and there was blood stains on the floors, and Jeanette and Harvey were nowhere to be found. However, in the dining room, there were plates set and food half eaten, as though they had sat down for dinner that evening. Now, as Lynn walked through the house, he was not expecting to come face to face with one of the members of the family. And that was Rochelle, the 18-month-old daughter herself, in her crib, looking right back at him. She had been chewing on the top of her cot in the bar as though she was hungry, but her eyes were sunken in. However, she was not screaming or acting as though she was visibly hurt at all. And in fact, this is when Lynn left her in the crib and went back to his own home, where, because of course there wasn't cell phones at the time, to make a phone call back to the man who was going to buy the livestock. His name was Ronald Rightback, and so Lynn called him and said to basically not come, and had to wait about 15 minutes for him to call back. And then Jeanette's father, Lynn, decided to go and pick up his friend Owen Priest and take him back to the Crewe house. Now, Lynn didn't really tell Owen about what had happened, or that they were missing, or that anything was really out of the ordinary. I mean, he told them that they were missing, but it was kind of just a, oh, I don't know where they are type of thing, rather than they have disappeared, there's blood stains on the floor, and something is wrong. But when they got there, Lynn decided to take Rochelle at about 1:45 to a local family that he knew that would take good care of her while they searched. And while he did so, Owen was actually the one to call the police for the first time. It had been about an hour since Lynn had originally found that they were missing, and Owen was the first one to call the police. Now, a constable or a peace officer in a little town who basically doesn't have much say in what goes on was sent, and he got there, but after looking around the house, the higher-ups in the police department basically told him to just make sure nobody went in, but to not touch anything. And so that's what they did, and it took the other police officers about an hour to get there. And once they did, they noticed that there was actually blood all over a rocking chair in the living room, but there was also brain matter. The search began with up to 80 police and volunteers searching the entire farm. However, investigators had little hope after looking at the crime scene that these two would actually be alive if they were found, and in fact they theorized that these two were probably bludgeoned to death with some sort of wooden stick, and then the wood was possibly put in the fireplace where there was a lot of debris at the time. The only problem was their bodies weren't in the home or anywhere around, so they had no idea what had actually happened to them. The Crews had actually been seen 5 days prior on the 17th, and the next morning, their delivery boy who went and dropped off milk and bread and newspaper noticed that they hadn't picked up their prior day's worth of food and newspaper, and it was still just sitting there. Then a witness did report that on the 19th, 2 days after the actual Crewe family had been seen, they had seen a woman go up into the Crewe house. She parked her car, which was thought to be a Hillman, which this witness had seen in the area before, and a woman got out who was about 5'8", wearing slacks and had fair hair, but it wasn't blonde. Now, at first, the main suspect was Jeanette's father, Lynn Demler, because he had acted so strangely. He didn't call the police right away. He didn't think Rochelle needed any help, even though she had looked like she had been in this cot for days now without anyone there to take care of her as an 18-month-old baby. He also had a scratch on his neck, and then bloodstains were found in the passenger seat of his car, and the blood type matched Jeanette's. Now, Lynn also acted very strange throughout these searches. He would go on his horseback with them, but it was almost like he didn't really want to, like it was an inconvenience to him. And he even said that there was no point in searching the land because they would be in water. Now, he said this without any prompting from anybody else, and yet when he was questioned, he said he didn't know what happened, and all evidence against him was circumstantial, so he was never arrested. After 2 months of searching, on August 16th, 2 fishermen would be the ones to come across a body. It was in the Waikato River, and they would see a woman floating, wrapped in a duvet, bound with fencing wire that was copper. Now, they identified this body as Jeanette Crewe. Now, once they retrieved her body, they found she had been shot once in the head by a .22 caliber gun and had also been bludgeoned on her head. She had a broken jaw and missing teeth. A few months later, Harvey was found a little bit upstream in a place called Devil's Elbow. He was also wrapped in clothing and this wire, but he was also being held down by a car axle, actually. And it was a 1929 Nash axle. He had also been shot in the head. However, with Jeanette's body, they almost believed that she had been sexually assaulted, which kind of pointed away from her father in many people's eyes. But they would soon have a new suspect in this case anyways. On October 27th, investigators went back to the Crewe house because a detective was looking at photos of the crime scene and noticed if you stood a certain way outside of their house, you could actually get a straight shot into the window, into the rocking chair that had all of the bloodstains on it, as though Harvey had been sitting there. You could get a straight shot into there, especially if the window was open. And right below that was the garden, so they decided to go back and search it for the 3rd time. And that really was the charm, because they found a shell casing 2 to 3 inches into the dirt. You see, when they first found the Crewe bodies, they had tested 64 firearms that were registered in the area to see if they could have possibly been involved in the shooting. And out of all of those, there was one that was not eliminated, but not necessarily thought to be the exact match. They couldn't say it was, but it wasn't eliminated, and that was from a man named Arthur Allen Thomas. And now with the shell casing, it had marks that proved that this was from Arthur's gun. Now, when they first saw that his gun could not be eliminated, they of course questioned him, but they really didn't look into an alibi, and they gave him back his gun like the day after because he was not being thought of as a suspect because they were focusing all of their time and energy on getting Lynn. But Arthur was a neighboring farmer of the Crews, and when they went to search his property, they found that the axle that was tied down to Harvey was actually had pieces welded off of it on his farm. And the wire at Arthur's farm, they tested like several different farms and their wires to see which was the closest, and the one at Arthur's was said to be the closest. In that November, Arthur was arrested and charged with murder, even though his wife and cousin had given alibis that he had been with them that day, and those had actually checked out. But many thought that his wife, Vivian, was actually the woman seen going into the house later that week after they had already been murdered. However, the witness that had seen the woman said that Vivian wasn't the woman, but could this have been why and how the baby survived? Two pediatricians that looked at Rochelle after this said that she hadn't lost enough weight for her to have gone 5 days without any source of fluids whatsoever, and that somebody had most likely been in there feeding her. There was also evidence that her diaper had been changed throughout those 5 days as well. I mean, it was dirty when they found her, but it wasn't dirty enough to have 5 days worth of bowel movements inside. Arthur's motive was said to be a long-time romantic interest obsession with Jeanette, and that before the murder there had actually been multiple break-ins where the only things taken were like sentimental things from Jeanette, stuff that didn't necessarily have that much value but that were very sentimental to Jeanette. And there was also a fire that was set, arson, twice, and one of them was in their actual bedroom. Clothes were set on fire, and at this time Lynn, Jeanette's father, was eating dinner with them, so it's not like he could have done it. And their barn was also burnt down at one point completely. And Lynn Dimmler even testified against Arthur, saying that he had always pestered Jeanette. However, he had never said anything about this or Arthur before. It just randomly came up in court. But in 1971, Arthur was convicted of this murder. The conviction ended up being overturned on appeal, and then 2 years later he was convicted yet again. However, many didn't believe that Arthur was guilty and started a campaign saying that this entire case had serious anomalies. A journalist named Pat Booth of the Auckland Star was actually the one who got this campaign going, who was leading it, getting the information out to the public, and this was with the help of forensic scientist Dr. Jim Sprott. And he was allegedly finding that this cartridge was placed and not actually found. And then Arthur had served 9 years when he was released on the recommendation of the Prime Minister in 1979, and he was actually given almost $1 million for his loss of time and loss of the farm while he was in jail. However, some of his cellmates had said that he had confessed to the murders. But this same cellmate who said that also said that multiple different people confessed to multiple different things and was known to make up stories. Because of all of these allegations against the police department, the Royal Commission of Inquiry were actually forced to review this case, and allegedly they found that the shell casing was actually made after the murders by the impounded gun that Arthur had given for evidence. And then from that it was placed at the Crews to make it appear as though it had happened there. Now, 2 detectives were implemented in doing this, but they were never really arrested, or nothing was ever really done with this at all. But if it wasn't Arthur, then who? Well, looking into Jeanette's family history, her past a little bit, it was found that in 1962 her father Lynn was forced to give half of the farm that he owned to his wife, which was now his ex-wife, due to owing $10,000 because of tax evasion. And then fast forward to a few months before Jeanette and Harvey's murders, Jeanette was actually given the other half of her parents' farm from the will of her mother, who had just passed away. Because you see, Jeanette's sister had been taken out of their mother's will, and in retaliation, Lynn had taken Jeanette out of his, and because he did this, her mother made Jeanette the one who got the other half of the farm instead of just giving it back to Lynn. But could this property have been enough motive for Lynn to kill his daughter? Or was it possibly her sister? Well, there was in fact a whole nother suspect in this case. He was Rod Rasmussen, and he was a local mechanic who often worked with this car axle found on Harvey in the water. And he would often cut it out of different vehicles, place it in another, and was said to often work with it and possibly be the last one to work with it. However, he said he had never worked with it at all, even though he was the mechanic in the area. And Arthur had even said at one point that Rod had come to his farm to cut it out of a vehicle there, which is why police found evidence of parts of that axle at his farm. Then Rod came up with this weird story saying that he had found a whole bunch of guns underneath a water barrel at his beach house, including a .22 caliber that he had told police about, and the police had zero record of him ever doing this. And one of his relatives even blamed him, accused him of murdering the Crews, and that his wife was the one who went and took care of the baby. Now, fingerprints were taken from the Crewe house, but most were never identified, and Rod's fingerprints were never taken, and none of the wives in any scenario had their fingerprints taken as well to see if they were the ones with the baby. Fast forward to 2014, and there was another official police review of this case, and they found that there was possibly evidence that there was a fabrication. However, they just kind of glossed over it, and they also said that Lynn Dimmler was definitely not a suspect. There was, however, another suspect found. Now, I told you that there were 64 guns tested in this area that were registered, and one of them, of course, that was not eliminated belonged to Arthur Allen Thomas. However, there was another one that belonged to the Erie family. Now, in this Erie family, there was a boy named Mickey Erie who had a disability and he couldn't talk. Now, he had a motive for why he could have done this, because he had worked for the Crewe family and had often been thrown off their property by Harvey in an angry rage at several different times. Now, his mother said he never went out at night alone, he wouldn't have done this, but many witnesses said that they often saw him out walking about and even sometimes with a gun. And one family even said they saw him on their porch with a .22 caliber rifle. And allegedly, the car axle found with Harvey was at one point dumped on the side of the road, kind of close to the Erie farm. However, the only problem with this theory is how in the world would Mickey, who was walking, who had probably zero help, have gotten these bodies to the water on his own? He was a big, strong guy, but two people to get them without anyone noticing would be a little difficult, especially because Harvey was a big man as well. However, another theory is that it was a murder-suicide and that possibly Harvey had broken Jeanette's jaw, and that is why that was broken and she was missing teeth, and in retaliation she shot him, but then realized what she had done, regretted it, and shot herself. And then possibly, you know, the family found out before they said they did and disposed of the bodies to keep up a good reputation. I mean, her father did have a farm to uphold and their farm that he could take over. And possibly that could be it. However, I'm not so sure about that. I think the mother would have thought more about her little baby to just take her own life than that. Although you never really know what's going on in someone's head. Now, I think a huge part of this case that should have been looked into more is who the actual woman was who took care of the baby, because I think that could have exposed everything. I mean, how would this woman have known to take care of her? Why did she do it? It would really open up a lot of doors. And in court for this trial of Arthur, the witness who had seen the woman had actually seen the woman again in court, or said to have, and had told police, but was just ultimately dismissed and said it didn't matter anyway. But this woman was named Norma Eastman. She claimed to have nothing to do with the murders. However, she had worked for Lynn Dimmler for years and had worked with all parts of their family, had taken care of multiple people, would make them dinner all the time, and was supposedly related to him by marriage. But then the most interesting information was found. On April 7th, 1972, 2 years after the murders, it was said that Lynn and Norma were married in a secret ceremony. But who do you think killed them? Was it Arthur out of jealousy, Mickey out of revenge, or Lynn out of greed? And whichever one you pick, how does a woman connect, and why? Now, I don't know if they ever looked at Jeanette's sister in this case, but I do think that there's a good possibility she could have been the one to look after the baby, especially if the people in the area didn't really know who she was, but had seen her car before. She could have gone there before, but it wasn't really, that common in the area. Nobody really knew her that well. And if that's the case, does that mean that Lynn killed them, and of course then his other daughter would know about it? I mean, I did tell you that there was eaten meals on the table, but there were actually 3 plates, 2 of which were just fish remains, and then the other was an untouched flounder. Did they possibly invite Lynn over and then he was a little late, so they went ahead and ate, and then he came in and murdered them? I mean, that would make sense as to why the baby was taken care of, the farm animals were taken care of, they were literally fed and completely fine when found 5 days later, and why he didn't take Rochelle with him, because he knew she was completely fine, nothing had happened to her, she was a-okay. And also, if Lynn wanted the farm for himself, he wasn't gonna let it, deteriorate while nobody had known that the Crews were missing. He would have kept it up. And if it was Lynn, was it Jeanette's sister or possibly Norma who helped him? I just really, something about how Lynn acted. I mean, you never really know how someone's gonna act in a situation like that, because until you're put in that situation, you don't even know. But something about it just feels really iffy. I mean, no matter what, I would have taken that baby with me. No matter what. I don't care if it's disturbing evidence, because it's a baby that needs help and is gnawing on a crib because it's hungry. I'm gonna help it. Or at least, call police and say, can I help it? Now, Rochelle has basically grown up seeking justice for her parents, and she was super excited in 2014 when her grandfather's name was cleared. However, she still wants to know what really happened. This one truly is a murder mystery, a double homicide mystery. I think that the hardest part is when you think that it's a family member, because you don't want to blame somebody who's possibly grieving, but it does seem the most likely. So yeah, I'd love to hear your theories. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.